My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Steve Vuylsteke. It's March 24th, 2025, with the SakéOne offices in Beaverton. And Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
First question, why wine?
Why wine? Well, I was probably 5 or 6 years old when my parents started making wine in our garage. And I think my first memories probably had to do with looking at these jugs, which are carboys, with the fermentation locks on the top, the bubbler kind that allowed the bubbles to escape, and you kind of could get fixated on that. So I remember that. And I remember just the breadth of the different kinds of wines my parents would make as amateurs. We lived in Beaverton at the time, and it just seemed pretty fascinating that they would take fruits and things. They would try all kinds of different things, dandelions. There's a lot of different things, and put them into these jugs and then drink this stuff. So, of course, from a 5 or 6 year old perspective, that's what I saw. But I was fortunate as the ensuing years to see interest by our next door neighbor in the wines and that they made, and so that was the genesis behind the start of Oak Knoll Winery. And so,
How old were you when Oak Knoll started?
I was 11.
Okay.
Yeah, and I recall all the driving around Washington County looking for suitable sites to start a winery. And they found the site out in south of Hillsboro where the winery's been for, I think, coming up on 55 years. So I remember when they said, okay, we're moving to Hillsboro, I was not terribly happy, because back then, if you lived in Beaverton, you thought people in Hillsboro were kind of lived in the sticks. Well, once I moved to Hillsboro, it's like, well, the people in Forest Grove live in the sticks. So it was just kind of one of those things. I remember I had a paper route at the Valley Times in Beaverton. So then it's like, oh, now we get the Hillsboro Argus. So it's kind of like, it took some adjustments. But, when you're 10, 11, you can adjust pretty quick. So. Next thing I know, my parents are converting this former milking parlor in this dairy, the Burkhalter Dairy, into Oak Knoll Winery. And by the time they got all the equipment, it was too late to make any fruit wine, because that's basically what they primarily made as amateurs. And so they did find some grapes. There weren't a lot of grapes grown back in 1970. I'm pretty sure there was under 100 acres in the entire state. So the first wine made was a rosé. And then the following year, strawberry season came, and then the other berries came along, and away they went. So, I think back in that era, not uncommon to put your kids to work. So we all worked in the winery. It'd be crushing fruit. I had a pretty steady hand, so I got to put the labels on bottles. I'd come home after school and put labels on bottles. And so the early years were pretty interesting, because there weren't that many wineries around.
What did you think of the work?
Oh, I thought it was way better than picking berries. Because that's what you did at that age. It wasn't that I didn't pick berries. We did, but I found it pretty fascinating. And little did I know what was happening then, particularly on the vinifera side of the industry, would grow to where it is today. Because then, there were, I think, 4 other wineries. And I remember the Eyrie Vineyards. David Lett was getting his federal bond at about the same time, and I know he and my parents, there was some conversations back and forth, because he really wanted to have Oregon bonded winery number 50. And well, actually, I don't think, my parents didn't have any say in it. This was a TTB decision. And I was told that he wanted Oregon Bonded Winery number 50 because he had a dog that he loved named 50. So anyway, I think Irie became Oregon Bonded Winery number 49. Oak Knoll became number 50. And then you had the others that came along soon after that, Tualatin Vineyards, Ponzi Vineyards, Charles Corey. Charles Corey, I don't remember if he was 48 or 51, about the same time. But you kind of get the very brief landscape there. You had Hillcrest Vineyards down in Roseburg. And then you had some of the other fruit and berry wine producers, Honeywood in Salem. There's a fruit and berry winery called Ma Bender, or Ma Bender's Pioneer Homestead Winery out in Sandy. And Henry Andre's winery out in Oregon City. These were some real characters. Besides the fact that they were, making wine before anybody thought of planting Pinot Noir or Chardonnay or any of the others.
So as you were coming up into like high school age and beyond that, what were you thinking wine would be something you would keep doing?
Well, as I became a teenager and got more involved, it was getting more of the hands-on, understanding what went into making wine. And it was interesting for me because it wasn't, at that point when I was a teenager, maybe by 75, 76, it wasn't just the fruit wine. My parents started making varietal wine, made Zinfandel from one of the oldest vineyards out of the Dalles. It was called the Pines. And that vineyard had a very interesting story. It's probably been told a few times by guys like Lonnie Wright, where the previous owners didn't want it, so they burned it to the ground, and then the vines grew back up. And fortunately, they were hardy vines. But yeah, so we had Zinfandel from 71 to 74, and then beyond. But Pinot Noir started, I think the first release was a 1974 vintage. So even though the early years we were known primarily for fruit wines, we started making varietal wine. So that was pretty interesting to me, because I think back then, Americans didn't drink varietal wines. They drank jug wines, Almaden, Gallo, Inglenook, Parmesan. So that's what dominated the shelves in the stores. And so I remember some early trips with my dad where we would go, and I'd go along with him when he was trying to sell wine, whether it be here in Beaverton or in Portland or restaurants, and not that easy to do because, of course, there's no reputation for Oregon wine. People had no idea that wine could be made here. So actually, the fruit wines really dominated the early years, because I remember by 1978, our winery made about 1/3 of all the wine in the state. Yeah, a lot of it was fruit wine, of course, but I'm trying to remember what year it was that our wines had become pretty known here in Oregon, and the owners of a very prominent Portland distributor, the Al C. Giusti Wine Company, came and paid my parents a visit. I'll never forget this big black Lincoln rolling up, and these guys with these black suits getting out, and this thing looked pretty daunting to me. What is going on here? And we ended up being the first Oregon wine that they brought in, and really gave us kind of instant distribution certainly around the Portland area. And I remember, though, we had already established a relationship with Safeway, and my dad told Al Giusti, he said, well, you can distribute our wines, but we're going to keep the Safeway. And there was a lot of back and forth on that, but he let us, because back then we would fill up the van and haul it directly to Safeway's warehouse out in Clackamas. And so we had a direct relationship with Safeway back then. Of course, that lasted for a few years, and then we gave that business to the Giustis. But again, the evolution of the wine industry, not just Oregon, but in the United States, has come so far. So I know we'll talk about the history and where things are today versus back then. But those things really stuck in my mind. How difficult it was for the Pioneer Oregon winemakers to get anybody to pay any attention to them. And I'm sure, and I was fortunate because then as I went through, finished high school and got into college, I left and went down to Southern Oregon State College. I ran track there for a couple years. Loved it down there, but by my junior year, I was about to turn 21. I thought, this is kind of a financial burden on my parents. I was the first actually in my family to go to a four-year university. I've got 4 brothers and a sister. I'm number 3 in the lineup, so safely in the middle. So I decided I'd come back home. So I moved back home, enrolled in Portland State, and literally 3 weeks later I turned 21. So I started working in the tasting room like Thursday through Sunday. So some of the early steps into understanding the minds of wine consumers, and it probably helped pique my interest in wine marketing specifically. And I think one of the benefits I had of kind of knowing that I was finding my way, that the wine industry really intrigued me. So when I was my business coursework, marketing work at Portland State, it's nice to have something you sort of apply all this newfound knowledge to, rather than just trying to be a sponge and then go, okay, well, how do I apply this to something whenever I get out and whatever job I do? So it really kind of steered me towards my intrigue, particularly in marketing, but business overall. Just how do you run a business? And then, so yeah, I graduated from Portland State in 1981. Took 2 weeks off, and then started as the Oak Knoll sales and marketing director. Yeah, it would have been nice, reflecting back, because even back then, like a family business, it's always good to go off and work somewhere else and kind of establish a name for yourself and get some background, and then come back. Well, we really didn't have that. That really wasn't an option for us because the winery needed me. I mean, we needed my dad. He was a switch design engineer at Tektronix. He didn't really have a business background. My mother did, the books. I mean, way before computers, everything was written down. So, it was a good way for me to jump in with both feet in 1981. So even by then, maybe there's 20-some wineries in Oregon by then, maybe. Maybe, but all the challenges were still there in terms of securing distribution, securing a reputation for what the industry was trying to do, and that the collaboration aspect which followed really is sort of that was the groundswell. That's what enabled Oregon to succeed. And I know through probably your other interviews with the other Oregon pioneers, I think a lot of them gave credit to that collaboration. And when we get a little longer in the story, I'll explain where some of those were.
Definitely an ongoing theme in our interviews for sure. I'm curious about, as you're turning 21, you said you're taking business classes, you're now in the tasting room. What was it like on the consumer side selling wine? We'll get to distribution in a second, but I'm curious about when people came to the tasting room, what were they expecting? What were they asking? What were the customers like at that point?
Well, wine education has come a long way from then. And again, this move from jug wines to varietal wines, I think that was probably the biggest shift in the American wine industry for sure. Certainly. Because now we call it premiumization, where wineries are producing products trying to get consumers to move up in price point. And I think certainly when you started talking about the types of grapes that made the wine, rather than our first wines we called red grape wine, white grape wine, because they were blends of different things. It's like there was, you know, some oddball varieties that were, maybe some were table grapes, not Concord and Niagara. We made those as well, but we labeled them Concord and Niagara. So yeah, the movement towards varietal wines, and I think when you think about how can an emerging wine region become successful, I think the fact that the focus became around Pinot Noir, certainly in the Willamette Valley, that story's been told over and over again. When an industry hangs its hat on a variety and does it exceedingly well, people will pay attention to it. And so, you know, we certainly had that going for it. But the other challenge, though, was when you go back to the early 1980s, there were very few varietal Pinot Noirs labeled in the United States. There was a few in California. I remember Joseph Swan and Clos-de-Val. I mean, but a lot of those were really not true to the variety, because they would grow in the Napa Valley. They would grow Pinot Noir right next to their Cabernet block. So you can imagine, you know, the idea of matching the grape to the climate, that really wasn't in play at that point in time. So, but I think the biggest challenge was not only Oregon not having a reputation for the variety, but picking Pinot Noir, because the great Pinot Noirs at the time all came from Burgundy, and they weren't even labeled as Pinot Noir, right? They were the appellation. They were the appellation name, you know.
Yeah.
So here we need to educate Americans on what this variety is and how to say it, of course. So those are some fun, interesting challenges. But you know, the pioneering families all needed to find a way to make this a success, and it doesn't matter whether it was the Letts or the Eraths or the Ponzis or the Fullers or the Coreys. I mean, everybody had the same challenges back then. We had these fruit wines in our back pocket, which I think helped solidify our stability as a winery, particularly when my folks had 6 kids to feed, right? So, but I think what was interesting for me was growing up and being the one in my family, amongst my siblings, to take more of a leadership role in the winery, was that, wow, this winery does need to grow, because we're all growing up, we're becoming young adults, starting families. Can one winery support 6 families? That was a tall order back then. So I remember, like, I feel a little pressure. We need to make more wine. We need to sell more wine. And we need to sell wines at profitable price points as well.
So tell me about that. I was going to ask about initial challenges, and you just nailed that for me. So tell me about taking this role right out of college. What were the first things you had to do, and how did you sort of go about setting the path forward?
Well, there were challenges, of course, and a lot of them had to do, how do we move wine? And so when I started in June of '81, that following fall, I remember I said, well, we need to do something around Thanksgiving to get some attention and move some wine. So I think we were the first winery that actually had a Thanksgiving event. We had holiday case sale, which we got a tremendous amount of traffic. We sold a lot of wine, and that was the first kind of thing that I said, let's do this. Let's find a way to move some product. And then the following, let's see, actually, if I can back up just a little bit, May of 1980, so I was still in college, we had, it was going to be our, I can't believe it, 1980 was our 10-year anniversary for the winery. So we're like, well, let's have a festival. So we had pretty much the first kind of larger scale wine festival at the winery. And I remember we're going to get some good press. The TV station said, hey, we're going to come out. We want to see what this is all about. The event was called Bacchus Goes Bluegrass. We decided to have this bluegrass theme. And so here we were all set up. I remember Jeb Bush was stumping for his dad, and he was going to come out. And actually, he did come out. But what do you know? May 18th was the anniversary date of the winery. May 18, 1980 is the day that Mount St. Helens blew. So, unfortunately, a lot of local media thought that had a little bit more news prominence than going to visit going to a wine festival. But Jeb Bush still came out. That was good. And yeah, by 5 years later, oh my goodness, there was thousands of people. It was a 2-day event, and we would sell 500-600 cases of wine over a 2-day period, and it almost got too big for our space. Yeah, we had to have a shuttle bus shuttle people from the grade school so they could park off-site. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but eventually, it got kind of nervous because even then a lot of people, they would come discover wine, but they didn't drink wine regularly, so there are some challenges in terms of crowd control and some challenges there. But overall, those are the kind of things that got the product in people's mouths, and they could see that that this was something that tasted good. Because in the end, if the product doesn't taste good, particularly with wine, you can't afford not to make good wine. Even back then, today it's absolutely essential, right? You're not going to stay open if you don't make good wine, compelling wine. Of course, today with so many wineries, you better have a pretty compelling story about what your point of difference is, because there's just so many choices out there. Why should someone pick your wine over all the hundreds of others that are out there? So that was sort of in the early 1980s, and we, I said, well, let's look at it, from my marketing lens. We need to upscale our packaging, so we did a major label overhaul then, which for both our varietal wines and our fruit and berry wines, we had separate packaging for each, because previously it was sort of the same label used for both. So trying to kind of give a different identity to each, because they really appeal to different markets. And so as the 80s went along, we really, as a winery, became more and more focused on growing. I became more focused on growing the varietal side of the business. That was really where I could see the market going, and it was really hard to have a reputation for both. It's like, oh, those are the fruit wine guys. So that really headed us in that direction. And some of the early successes, I remember, it was the 1983 Oregon State Fair, where that was a pretty good watershed moment for Oak Knoll, when because the Oregon State Fair was the big wine competition back then. Everybody entered their wines in there, and we won the governor's trophy for both a Pinot Noir and our raspberry wine. So here we kind of swept the awards. And Andrei Chelichev, one of the legendary winemakers in California, he was one of the judges, and he was particularly enamored with the 1980 Pinot Noir that my parents made, and said it was one of the best Pinot Noirs he ever made. In fact, apparently there was some discussion about which Pinot Noir would get the best of show, the governor's trophy, and he stood up, and he was not a very tall man, and he said, "This is one of the best Pinot Noirs I've ever tasted. I would defend this wine with the last breath in my little body." Kevin Chambers, he was one who heard that quote and shared that with my family. So that was big for us, but really more on a local scale. But soon thereafter was when the first Oregon Pinot Noirs were reviewed by Robert Parker in the Wine Advocate. Unfortunately, our Pinot Noirs from 1982 and 83 were included in his reviews, and they were favorable. And then followed by the 85 vintage. Again, he really, those are the vintages that really put, I think, Oregon Pinot Noir on the map in a broader spectrum. I mean, way back when it was always the 75 Irie South Block. That was, the definitive wine. But I think from American consumer standpoint, this, you can make great wine, but you have to make enough volume to where people can get their hands on it. So either you have way too much wine, which is what the industry had in the early 80s, to where then you hope at some point, could you ever become allocated? Mm-hmm. And that did eventually happen.
So when you're talking about both growing in scale and also focusing on Pinot Noir varietal wine, how do you go about doing that? How do you go about scaling up a winery at that time?
Well, after the Oregon State Fair, I remember I got a phone call from Stephen Carey, Carey Oregon Wines. I know I'm sure he's been interviewed. May he rest in peace. He was the first one to take Oregon wines out on a national level, and actually get distributors outside of the Northwest to actually say, oh, we'll take a chance on these wines, whether it was in San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, New York. And so Oak Knoll joined some of those early wineries that were part of his portfolio, which included, no surprise, Adelsheim, Ponzi, Irie, Knudsen Erath. I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two.
Elk Cove?
No, I don't think Elk Cove was part of that in the early years. Elk Cove and Sokolblosser were locally distributed by Lemma Wine Company. And there was an individual you need to interview at some point named Lane Witherell, who was actually Oak Knoll's first sales manager, and then left after a few years and went to work, and he was running the wine program for Lemma, and he went on. But he's actually an Oregon wine historian, and he's currently living in Portland, Maine. He would be an interesting interview, but I digress. So, and so I think kind of being older, the first of the second generation to kind of go out and try to market and sell Oregon wine. And here I'm out there on the road with Dick Ponzi and David Adelsheim and Myron Redford from Amity. And we would go from city to city. I remember Dick Ponzi had, and back then you'd just take your samples on the airplane with you. And, being the engineer, he had a suitcase handle thing with straps. So he figured out a way to carry a case of samples with a handle, because we're all schlepping all our samples on the planes. But it was interesting because we would go to a market and we would work, with different salespeople. And generally there would be an Oregon wine dinner that night at a restaurant. And it was interesting because we'd talk about, did we have any successes? And it was almost like if any of us got a placement, it was like, yeah, we got an Oregon wine placement. It wasn't like, oh, I got all my, I got 6 placements today. It was like, it didn't matter. As long as you got an Oregon placement, it's like, you kind of stuck a stake in the ground in that market. So at least there's some Oregon wine happening there. So that happened in a lot of the big cities. And soon after that, events followed, consumer events and such. But I do remember one dinner in particular. It was in Boston, and it was a restaurant that was a converted church. And we were all there. And I just remember sitting there going, we're having this Oregon wine dinner where each of us, had a different wine with a different course as part of the overall menu. And just sitting there, it's like, this is a church. This is kind of weird. But that's what you did back then. You just found those places where you hoped you could get an audience. And those very early years, though, were very interesting that way, and very interesting for me because I got to spend time with all the pioneers out there. We all had the same challenge: how do we get placements?
I'm curious from your perspective and from their perspective. Obviously, it's a tough hill because you're trying to introduce people to Oregon and Pinot Noir and all of these things kind of simultaneously. How do you stay positive? How do you keep going on that road when it's a challenge like that?
Oh, well, I think it's interesting because success does breed success. And so literally by then, we're into the 87, 88 period, and then there was enough traction. Robert Parker had written up the wines, the Wine Spectator, which for years were kind of looked down their nose at Oregon. They're all about Washington, and I'll never forget an article that was written about the wines of the Pacific Northwest that the Wine Spectator did. And they interviewed Alan Shoup, who was the president of Saint Michel Wine Estates. Chateau Saint Michel then, I can't remember what they called it exact. It was Saint Michel Vineyards. Anyway, and I remember he was quoted as saying, they asked him, well, what about Oregon? And he said, oh, no, the future of the Northwest is in Washington. It's too wet in Oregon. And I'm just like, here, and I'm sure my comrades, same thing in Oregon, were like, what? You can't grow, well, you could try to grow Pinot Noir, and they're even, I think they're having some success. But, you don't think of Eastern Washington and think of successful Pinot Noir producers. And so, yeah, there were challenges in the early days because, Saint Michel, which was owned by U.S. Tobacco, I mean, they had a lot of money behind them. And so they could go out and produce some of the first, what were then called fighting varietals that now carved a niche. And so, yeah, they had the money, they had the muscle, and no one in Oregon, these were all small family-owned wineries, bootstrap operations. And I think about then, it started to dawn on me how challenging the wine industry was for these pioneers. And it took a tremendous blow on marriage after marriage, including my parents. The Fullers at Tualatin, the Adelsheims, the Letts, the Sokol Blossers, the Schaefers, Erath, yeah, and so that was tough. That was tough to see that, but it just personified how difficult it was to be successful in business when you're trying to grow a fledgling industry and try to work together and time on the road. Whenever you're not in the winery, you have to go out and sell it. So who's mining the wines? Who's mining the family? So it was no different from my family. It was a blow. And so by the late 80s, then suddenly I was in a position where then, with my parents' divorce, I had to step in to the leadership role for our company. And it was difficult. When you have a family operation where your siblings and your parents, that's their livelihood. So how do we move this thing forward despite those challenges? And so that was a challenge I think a lot of our comrades in certainly the pioneers faced. And I don't know that people really know how difficult it was personally on families back then. But but the benefit was at the time more and more notice about the quality of the products. Of course, then Robert Drouhin takes interest in Oregon, and we started to see some money flow into the state in terms of investment. And of course, the growth continued in terms of acres planted, in terms of new wineries, and that spawned some of the events. I think the industry then said, we've done a good job of working on the road together. Well, we got to get people to come to Oregon, right? So the International Pinot Noir Celebration was put together. And I was asked to join that board, I think in year 3, around 1990. And I'll never forget one of the first board meetings. Like, okay, well, we need to figure out the budget. And I said, well, where's the budget? And someone passed around. It was just a yellow piece of paper, and it had all this written on it. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, we're going to have all these hundreds and hundreds of people, and this is the budget. This is how they do it. But it was Oregon Wine 101 bootstrap, right? Didn't matter. But obviously the event took off in a way that I don't think anybody ever imagined. And so a few years later, that was followed by the Salud Oregon Pinot Noir auction. I was joined, Nancy Ponzi, Paul Hart, who owned Rex Hill at the time, Bob Gross, Cooper Mountain, and myself. We were sort of the winery group that joined some surgeons and physicians at Tuwali Hospital with this idea. I think they really wanted to find an event that the foundation could use to get money for their foundation. Sure. But we said, if we're going to partner with you, there's a real need here, and that was the need for the vineyard workers, the primarily Latino vineyard workers who were seasonal, would come in, work in the vineyards, obviously do the harvesting, and weren't eligible for any health care. And so it was that became one of my one of the projects that I really got behind in a big way early on. And that event has also evolved through the years, but the very first years we thought, well, we wanted to kind of pattern it after the Hospice de Beaune in Burgundy. So we actually partnered with a tonnellery out of France, and we got like actual half barrels. And I think we had around 20 wineries in the first years. Each winery got their own barrel. And so the special cuvee would go into that barrel. And when it came time to do the first Salud tasting, it was at Rex Hill. And I don't know if all of us did, but several of us brought our barrel on a small pallet, so we were actually tasting out of the barrel. Well, I remember the wines are very cold, and I think after the first year we said, this is a lot of trouble. Let's find a better way to show them. So we eventually moved to just showing them in bottles. But that, again, industry coming together, in this case for a specific cause. And of course, that I'm so pleased that effort continues today and has raised so much money for that important cause. So yeah, I at one point after a few years was the chair of that. I was the president of the IP&C board. I kind of went through, and I was the guy that the next generation that kind of came in again with the founding folks. So it wasn't just going out and selling, but helping to develop these events that would help promote Oregon wine. And I think one of my favorite stories, maybe it wasn't a favorite at the time, was IP&C had become, it got to where it was selling out every year. Tickets were in high demand. And yet the board, we were thinking, we really need to enhance the media aspect of this. We need to get media to come and promote it. Just like we wanted people to come to Oregon to see the Willamette Valley, see the wineries. So the board decided we need to invite key media people to come and actually be the MC of the event, which spawned people like Jancis Robinson. What was his name? David Apple? He was from Washington, D.C. There was several. I mean, obviously we're looking at key wine folks or key media people that could shine this positive light on what we were doing. The problem we had was every year since the event was founded, David Lett was the MC. And so we're like, okay, well, we're going to make this shift. And and I think they must have, the other board members must have had their little side conversation, because they said, Steve, we want you to explain this to David. And I said, you want me to go tell David Ladd, sorry, we don't need you as the MC anymore? Yeah. I said, well, okay. So I went and saw him, and I explained everything, and he looked at me and he goes, must have took some balls to say that. And I was like, yeah, but, I think there's a purpose here. And he said, I get it. I'm okay with it. And so from then on, every year there was a different one. But I'm like, you're going to ask me? I mean, he was the face in a lot of ways, and rightfully so. And of course, he continued to participate in the event. And anyway, so then of course other events spawned. Oregon Pinot Camp, which became trade only. So I got to chair that event too. And actually, the year, so that actually was, we're now into 2002, 2001? Let me think about this. 2002. Actually, this was when, it was soon after the movie Sideways came out. And actually, I was at Erath. Let me think about this. Oh, this was actually a fair amount later. I'm trying to think exactly when Pinot Camp started, but this was probably more like 2000 and, let me think about this, 2006, because in 2002, I kind of talked about some of the challenges of a family winery. Parents are divorced, and actually it was on the heels of 9/11. 9/11 had grave impact on a lot of businesses, and certainly Oregon Wines were part of that. We had a large deal with Delta Airlines. I think we were going to sell them like 5,000 cases of Chardonnay. And everything's all set up, and then 9/11 happens. And of course, that put that on hold. And, wine is, we're subject to recessions and all those things too. And things were difficult in 2001. And the following spring, I just kind of came to loggerheads with my father about where we're going as a company, and I decided to leave, and interviewed and became the new general manager and sales manager at Erath Vineyards. So it was very difficult. I'd spent so many years with the family business, but it was something I just had to do for myself and for my family. Married, I had 2 kids, and but yeah, one of the most difficult decisions I had to make. But at the time, Dick Erath needed someone to step in. He had planned to sell his winery to Rob Stewart, and Rob was lining up his investors, and Rob found he got enough investors to start his own winery rather than take over Erath. But Dick already had at least one leg out of the winery at that point, because he thought Rob was going to buy his winery. So now he's back in. He needed someone. Rob had already taken and created a new marketing plan. Anyway, I stepped into a situation where there was a lot of single vineyard and upper end Pinot Noirs, where Erath was really more known for that bread and butter, great, $15 bottle of Pinot, that everyday wine, and that wine kind of started getting thinned out a little bit, because a lot of the good juice went into those upper cuvées, and so so that was 2002, and so kind of had to step back and redo what was going on at Erath. This is an interesting point, I think. A lot of, when you think about wine from a business standpoint and a marketing standpoint, I remember back then thinking about looking at, in California, there's a couple wineries that came to mind that were very successful from a marketing standpoint. And those were Silver Oak and Sonoma-Cutrer. Silver Oak, they only made Cabernet Sauvignon. At the time, Sonoma-Cutrer only made Chardonnay. And my parents were guilty of this. So many Oregon wineries were guilty of this. It's like they made way too many different wines. Way too many. So I remember telling Dick Erath, I'll come work for you, but you got to let me take the reins, particularly from the marketing standpoint, because that's how you're going to survive. Because, yeah, he had a couple kinds of Riesling. He had Gewürztraminer dry and late harvest, and he had what was the Italian variety, the Arnese, that he and Dick Ponzi were all enamored with. And so I said, you got to let me do it. He said, okay. And so I had to come in and, kind of clean house, pare things back, pare down the number of single vineyards, kind of reestablish the Oregon Pinot Noir as the flagship for the winery. And then a nice little boost came along, and that was the movie Sideways, which shone that incredible spotlight on the variety in a very positive way. So the Sideways effect had a profound impact on Pinot Noir, not just Oregon, but nationally and globally, really. And so I just remember watching the orders go up and up and up. And Erath, at the time, we were one of the largest producers of Pinot Noir in the state. And next thing I know, we were out of wine. We were out of wine. All I could think back was to those years in the early 80s when this was about the time the Oregon Wine Advisory Board was founded. And I remember the wine industry had a retreat out of Eugene. I think Doyle Hinman was the one that put it together. And we were all in this lodge, and we're all talking about, what are we going to do? Everybody was swimming. Everybody had like 2 or 3 vintages of Pinot Noir. Like, how are we going to move all this inventory? And so to fast forward to the Sideways effect, and here is one of the biggest producers, and we're out of Pinot. And so next year we're like, okay, we got to, instead of bottling it in August, we're bottling in June. And I remember having distributors that said, how many truckloads can I order? And it was like, holy, wow, this is something. To see the industry come full circle that way was pretty satisfying, of course. But then it presented a whole new set of challenges, right? How do you meet the demand now? And so, it was then that maybe a year or so after we were filled up at Erath. We couldn't make any more wine. An entity in Washington set up a new custom crush winery called 12th and Maple Wine Company down in Dundee. They converted a former nut drying facility, spent a lot of money. So they started making some of our Pinot Noir down the hill. And at that time, Dick Erath and I, we were starting, he said, we need to find a site, because when he and Cal Knutson put Knutson Erath together, and then when they parted ways, Dick had I can't remember how many year lease on the winery there in the middle of the Knutson vineyard. And the lease was going to be coming up in I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years, but from making wine, you got to find a site, got to build a winery and all that. So we were actively looking for sites to build the new Erath winery. And I came in the office one day, and my assistant came in and handed me a letter. It was just addressed to Erath Winery, which she opened, because she just opened it. And I'm looking at this letter, and it was from Ted Basler, who was at that time the president of Saint Michel Wine Estates. And I'm reading this, and he goes, "Hey, Dick, glad we were able to come to terms." come to terms? What? What is this all about? I called Dick. He came down, and I showed him the letter, and he said, yeah, they made me an offer. They want to get in the Pinot Noir business. And all the things that flashed through my head at the time. Alan Shoup saying, Oregon will never amount to anything. So I thought, wow, well, this is significant. Again, it was one of those touchstone moments in the Oregon wine industry where one of the large powerhouses said, Oregon wine is for real. Oregon Pinot Noir is for real. And so, 6 months later, Saint Michel, Erath became part of the Saint Michel portfolio.
2006?
This was 2007. So it was like July of 2007. And so then we sort of had to learn. And this was personally kind of a challenge for me because having ran my family winery and then having ran Erath for 6 years, it's like these are family wineries. You know, you can be nimble, you can react to market changes, and now we've got this big corporate winery, and actually had a manager, one of their managers from California, that was overseeing Oregon, so he became my boss. And I heard that statement more than once that said, you know what, Saint Michel, we measure 4 times and gut once. I said, okay, well, and so personally I thought, well, okay, I'm guessing Saint Michel won't stop at just Erath. They're going to probably develop an Oregon wine portfolio. I know everybody in the industry pretty much, so whoever they buy, it's like, okay, we're going to have some more. Ted Basil referred to it as his string of pearls because he was buying smaller boutique Washington wineries with the same idea. So I thought, well, they're going to carry that on into Oregon. And that didn't happen. By January of 2008, so we had one harvest there that I was there for under Saint Michel. And then, I was told, well, you can either, we can move you up to Woodinville. Well, I too had gone through a divorce. And so I had joint custody of my 2 older kids. I wasn't leaving the state. I couldn't leave the state. So they said, well, we're gonna let you go. Which I then came to learn that famous Australian term, I became redundant. And so it's like, okay, well, this is going to give me some time to sit back and know, what am I going to do next? I mean, Erath was a great success. Personally, it's one thing to work for, again, I didn't get the chance to go off and work somewhere else out of college. I had to jump right into the family winery. So having done that, working there for between 81 and so 18 years, is that right? Yeah. So actually working for another winery, and someone like Dick Erath, who was, very interesting individual. And we probably don't have time to get into all the details because we still need to talk about sake at some point. But having worked with him was.
Give us one good story working for Dick Erath.
Dick was a visionary in so many ways, but he was an engineer like my dad. They actually met at Tektronix, and so he had that engineering mindset, and he was tight. He was tight with his money, and here I'm commuting from Hillsborough to work to Dundee, and I would have to go back to go pick up my kids at their school in Hillsborough. So there were days when I would need to leave at like 2:30 or so. I mean, the winery was flourishing. And he came in one day and he said, Steve, as a general manager, you should probably be like one of the last people to leave each day. And I said, okay, Dick, well, I got my family life here too. And, my eyes are still on the prize here. The company's doing really well. And so this is what I got to give you. Never said another word. Although there was one other story. maybe I'd been on board for 6 months, and Dick and his son Cal worked on and off for Dick. I think Cal told me he'd been fired at least 8 or 9 different times. And Cal, may he rest in peace, he had a great palate, but he was, you know, he had his wild streak to him. And so he came back to work for Dick after I started and started calling on restaurants and accounts in the Portland area. And Dick came in one day and he said, well, Cal's having some pretty good success, but I think his image isn't what I'd like it to be. So you need to tell him that he needs to cut his hair. I said, and this is not me. I think I said, Dick, that's not in the job description to get Cal. Cal's he's a big guy. Anyway, a lot of people in the industry from back then, I'm sure, have a lot of other stories of Dick. But he was great. He was great to me. Gave me that opportunity. Had the faith in me to bring me on board, and yeah, rest is history there. So
something about you that makes other people think you can deliver bad news or tough news, apparently. I
don't know. I think I'm fortunate. I've got a lot of diplomacy, I think, in my craw. I think I'm a good listener, and I think I can get people to come together and find commonality from whether it's from the industry perspective. It's probably why I ended up, a lot of times, I'm not the type that says, oh, I'll join this board, but I want to run the board. That's not what I want. But over and again, that's what I ended up doing, because that's what I did. I gravitated towards that. And
so in 2008, you're not at Erath anymore. You're weighing your options for the future. What were you hoping for at that point? What were you sort of thinking as a next step?
Well, certainly I was looking at what my next steps in the Oregon wine business would be. But having just had a very successful stint, 6-year stint, 5.5 at Erath, it's like, well, what's next? So I talked to people like Bill Stoller, Joe Dobbs, looking at who could utilize my skill set. And then I also did some consulting for a few folks. But about a year had passed, and I really didn't find, one of the challenges of knowing everybody is you kind of know where all the skeletons are in the closets. So, who are you going to work for? Who could I work for? Who could I bring real value to? And so an opportunity came up for a general manager position at the 12th and Maple Wine Company. So I interviewed for that, and they hired me. So, and by then, most of the Erath production was now being made at 12th and Maple. So here I am, back in this sort of, Erath is the big customer now. So I'm kind of on the other side of the desk at that point. And we made, as Custom Crush Winery, we made wine for a lot of folks that were, again, trying to get a brand established. So I did that for about 1.5 years, but the management there, again, was based in Washington State, and I don't think I didn't feel like they really gave me a blueprint of a plan. And so I just kind of felt like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing for them. And, having worked and ran Oak Knoll and Erath, it's like I have my hands on the wheel, I'm driving the ship, and I didn't know where that ship was going. So by the summer of 2009, I got a call from a headhunter, and he said, well, we've got something, you've been recommended, we've got an opportunity. It's in the Portland area, and and I said, well, who is it? Well, we can't tell you who it is. And I said, well, okay. Well, can you give me a little bit of idea? Okay, yeah, they make about 70,000 cases. They're in the adult beverage industry. And I said, the adult beverage industry? I never really heard that. Sounded kind of sus. But I did a little checking, and I put some things together, and I figured out it was SakéOne. And I thought, wow, sake. Like most people my age at that time, you know, I'm 2009, so, you know, how old am I in 2009? 50. Yeah, I turned 50. So I'm like, well, this sounds interesting. It's in Forest Grove. It's 15 minutes from my house. And I did a little bit of research. I'm like, well, other than how sake is made, once they sell it, they're selling it through the exact same channels as wine, and spirits are sold and some beer. So I said, okay. So I interviewed, had 2 interviews, and they hired me. So I thought, okay, well, this is the next chapter for me. And I just jumped in with both feet, learned about sake making, learned about how sake is different from wine. But I'm sure that I was hired primarily because I was able to manage a production facility, bottle alcoholic beverage, and sell it through the 3-tier system. And that was 15 years ago that I took the job. And we went from being America's original craft sake brewery to now being not only that, there are now actually, gosh, I think close to 3 dozen craft breweries, sake breweries now in the United States. Back when I was there, we were the only craft sake brewery. There's 4 large kind of satellite breweries from large Japanese sake breweries that took up shop in California. But they were all making sake that would, for the most part, would sell an 18-liter bag-and-box that would be sold to Japanese restaurants. They would sell hot sake in the takuri, the little flasks, and in the little cups. And that was the lion's share of the sake market in the United States. So here we are. We're like, well, we're not. First of all, we couldn't compete with that. We were going to only produce what's called ginjo sake, which is a higher quality level, meant to be served chilled. So as I started gathering, you know, all this information about what sake is and the different quality levels, I'm just going, wow, Americans don't understand sake at all. I'm like, I definitely had this deja vu moment where I'm like, this is like Oregon Pinot Noir in the early 80s. People don't get it, and what are we going to do? What am I going to do about this? Well, you know, it's making those little victories day after day, and understanding from a production standpoint what went into making quality product. And the brewmaster at the time, he was not trained to brew sake. He went to Japan for 3 weeks, kind of learned how to do it, came back, and so he didn't have in-depth information. So I remember trying to have conversations with him about saying, okay, his name was Greg Lorenz. I mean, he was doing as best he could. I said, well, if sake brewing is like a chain, where are the weak links in the chain? And he said, well, our water is stored near the boiler, so the water is kind of warm. And he gave me a bunch of different examples, and I said, well, we're going to change all that. So we proceeded to do that. And so we had incremental growth probably for the first 6-7 years. And then at the same time we were growing our Oregon craft production, we started importing more Japanese sake from Japan, because what I found out was, and we primarily worked with the larger distributors, Southern Glazers, Young's Market Company, those types. And sake was like half of 1% of the wine business. So I'm like, okay, this is challenging. But it's like, hey, we're it. In terms of premium American-made sake, we're pretty much it. So we could really push that message on. And with sake, fresh is really good. You know, drink it within a year. So we continued to grow our production. We did some packaging changes. We did a lot of marketing work. Sake education every day of my life. And it's still that way even today. But as we continued to grow on our import side, we became kind of this like one-stop shop for sake for the large distributors, because they're not going to have, I mean, no different than, say, Italian wine importers, French wine importers. I mean, distributors don't want to deal with each of the individual suppliers. They want someone that's bringing them quality. Here you go. So I sort of used that as the model, and SakéOne became and is now the largest importer of Japanese sake in America. We aligned with the largest sake brewer in Japan, Hakutsuru, sake brewing company out of Kobe, Japan. They were founded in 1743, so over a 280-year company. I must say that one of the biggest challenges of dealing more directly with the Japanese, because over time, SakéOne eventually is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Hakutsuru. But when I joined in 2009, we had over 700 shareholders. Many of them were friends of the founders. The company was founded in 1992 between a local entrepreneur, Griff Frost, actually a Hillsborough High School graduate, just like me, a couple years ahead of me, and Momakawa Brewing of Japan, at the time the 33rd largest sake brewer in Japan. And it was their idea to develop SakéOne. Actually, it was called Japan American Beverage Company, and then Momakawa Sake Limited, and then eventually SakéOne. But their idea was to bring the premium sake concept to America. That's why the Ginjo grade. I mean, sake is really a very simple beverage because it's only made with 4 ingredients: rice, water, yeast, and a special mold spore called koji. And so it kind of gave us a platform to say this is a very simple beverage, but it can be very elegant and provide a lot of intrigue, just like wine. So when I joined SakéOne, I remember the first Daiginjo, which is kind of the top quality level, if you will, in terms of the milling of the rice. It gives you that more ethereal, kind of elegant product. I remember, here's Steve, this wine palate guy, and I'm tasting this. This is like a $60 sake. I'm tasting it, and I'm tasting it. I'm like going, I just can't pull any of my wine descriptors out of my vocabulary here. And I remember saying, this is like an exotic. Tastes like exotic rainwater. That was the best I could come up with. I laugh about it now, right? But anyways, I think it worked for me because it was about quality, and it was about educating Americans on there is something better, and who doesn't want better experiences in their life? And the whole food and wine scene that I grew up in and became part of through these elaborate events and dinners and such, I mean, those are very memorable occasions. And it's no different than really turning somebody on to that great bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir or Chardonnay or Pinot Gris or what have you. Same thing is when you can put an excellent sake in front of somebody and tell them just what do you think? And I mean, because for a lot of Americans, they've only consumed warm sake. And generally the sake is produced in California. I mean, they came and set up shop there for a reason, because the rice is cheap, electricity was cheaper than in Japan, and they had this access to this big market. And yet, those were some of the lower quality grades. They weren't indicative of what sake really could be at a premium level. So being involved at that, I was able to take what I learned with Oregon Pinot Noir and Oregon wine and apply it to sake. And now I'm going to retire in a year. I think I've done as much as I need to do. And I'm not going to go away. I'm going to stay on as a consultant, as a board director for the company. But yeah, it's been a fascinating ride to go from Pinot Noir to sake, and And people ask me this all the time, well, what do you drink when you go home? I'm like, I actually drink more sake than wine. Mm-hmm. But I still love great Pinot Noir. My wife loves Oregon Pinot Gris. We still drink wine. Mm-hmm. I'm still involved, kind of emeritus, mm-hmm. with the Salute auction. Mm-hmm. This last year, the raised over $1 million. I donated a 7-day sake trip to Japan. And actually, the couple that bid and won the lot are in Japan right now. Awesome. They're in right now. So they're going to visit like 3 different sake breweries and set them up on this plan. So despite not being in wine, this was, and it went for some pretty good money, I must say. I can still, have a pulse on what's happening. And of course, I still follow what's happening in the industry. But good grief, to go from 4 wineries when I was 11 years old to whatever it is, over 1,000 wineries now. It's pretty gratifying to look back and go, wow, I was able to work alongside the pioneers and eventually make a difference and work with Willamette Valley Winery Association, the Washington County Winery Association. I worked with the Washington County Visitors Association. So yeah, it's fun to do those things that can get people here and experience what makes Oregon so different as a place. And now we get a lot of folks that pop into our tasting room in Forest Grove or at SakéOne, and you can tell they don't know what to expect, but they leave there with a profound new knowledge of what sake can be. And I think it's only appropriate that SakéOne set up shop in the Willamette Valley, where the pioneering folks, it's not, as you know, it's not just wine, it's beer, it's cider, it's tea, it's coffee, it's kombucha, you can go on, mead. All these things. Oregon has that pioneering spirit where people are going to say, hey, I'm going to make something and make it really, really good and hang my hat on it. So there you go.
That's amazing. I love that you draw the parallel between early days Pinot Noir and having to educate on such a mass level and sake. So tell me about when you mentioned most Americans, which is my experience with sake, hot sake in a Japanese restaurant is all I know, right? And I'm typical. So tell me about what are the key points you try to educate people on, and how do you, I guess, what are the biggest sort of barriers, or what are the biggest things you need to overcome?
Well, certainly to gracefully tell people, no, not all sake is consumed warm. In fact, our brewery, we only make primarily sake that's meant to be served chilled. And no, we would appreciate it if you don't use our sake in a sake bomb. So, yeah, I knew I had a job worked out. I had a lot of work to do when I found out that's how Americans think of sake. So I think a couple things really helped. And it's not like the sideways effect for Pinot Noir, but it certainly helps that Japanese cuisine is by far and away the fastest growing cuisine globally. New Japanese restaurants in the United States over the last few years have surpassed all other cuisines combined. So you think about people just say, oh yeah, sushi. Well, now you've got ramen, you got yakitori places, you got omakase, which is sort of the traditional, several dishes of traditional Japanese foods. So that's actually allowed us to present our products to particularly the younger demographics. I think they're a little more open to products, and when we can tell them sake is really one of the most pure forms of beverage alcohol you can get. There's no sulfites. There's no histamines. The conagers, right? That's what's in whiskeys and things that overconsumption can cause you problems the next day. Sake is more gentle on the body. And also from a food and beverage pairing perspective, sake pairs with, I've yet to find a food that sake doesn't pair with. Because sake by its nature, it's made with rice. It's got a third or less the acidity of wine, so it's more gentle. It's really, the best way I've had it described to me is, if you think about a great meal, you want the entree to be sort of like the lead singer, and you want the beverage to be like the backup singers. Well, they need to work together, right? And sake is like the ultimate backup singer because it makes that dish shine better. And that's been a key. The other key is we've worked really hard to goad Americans into saying, now, you don't only drink sake with Japanese food. I mean, a good example, do you only drink Italian wine when you have Italian food? Do you, what do you have when you have Korean food? Or we tell people, well, what is really good? What do you really like? It's like, well, I really like fried chicken with sake, pizza with sake. Sake has the umami factor. And umami, which is present in mushrooms, tomatoes, beef, it's that kind of extra savory note. And when you combine, if you like those types of foods and you put them with sake, there's this magic that happens. So being able to get people to understand that and try it, again, it's a nice feather in the cap. And it's what we do to get people to understand that it's, hello, it's an alternative to good white wine. So, yeah. But again, I think younger demographics in particular, they're very much more experimental. I'm of the boomer generation, so it's a little difficult to get. But I've worked on my friends, and they're coming around a little bit on sake. But.
You mentioned you'd seen there's a growth in sort of that part of the sake market in America. How have you seen the evolution of sort of sake in America, specifically sake in America, and where is it going next on a market scale?
Well, sake has become, the Japanese government is working to make sake more, there's a heritage designation now that is in play with sake. So they're working to make sake really a new global beverage. Because, and it's essential for the industry, because in Japan, the number of sake breweries in Japan has declined from over 10,000 to 1,000 in the last 25 years. Because in Japan, consumption of sake is going down every single year. Younger demographics they're not drinking sake. They're drinking wine, they're drinking spirits, they're drinking beer. It's sort of perceived as kind of like my grandparents' drink. And so to save their industry, they really need to focus on getting sake exported. United States is one of the top export markets for Japanese sake. And again, it's the United States is sort of in that early, and here I'll throw kudos to Dick and Nancy Ponzi when they started Bridgeport Brewing here in Portland. One of the first brew pubs. Craft sake is now popping up around the United States. I think I mentioned earlier, close to 36 now. So many major cities now have a sake brewery. Biggest challenge, though, is you can't go to university to learn how to brew sake in America. So you really need to align yourself with a Japanese brewer and go do apprenticeship work and such. And that's really the key to continue to grow, particularly from a premium standpoint, to see that happening. But that is happening now. There's a North American Sake Brewing Association now. So the things that we kind of look back in the early days of Oregon wine or Oregon beer, that's happening now on a national level. So you'll start to see more sake becoming more and more in the limelight, I think, as we move ahead. And that's good. That's good. I think the beverage deserves it. It's good. It's really good.
Let's talk about wine a little bit. Obviously, you have seen most of the growth of Oregon wine in your life and your career. Tell me about the biggest changes, I guess. You've talked about some of the sort of the landmarks along the way, Drew Inn coming in and Robert Parker and things like that. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen? What is different about the industry now than in earlier days?
Oh, well, I had my company board meeting in Hawaii a month ago, and we ate at different restaurants every night. And to see Oregon wines on every single list, again, that is not lost on me for a second. How Oregon wine has come of age in such a positive way. And to see Oregon wines priced on the Pinot Noirs generally at comparable levels to California Pinot Noir and Burgundy, red Burgundies, it's like, geez, I never imagined that would ever happen. I'm sure the pioneers, maybe even second generation, we probably didn't ever think that was going to happen. But it has, and so I think that the challenge now is, what is really the next steps for the industry? Obviously, when you got 1,000 wineries and the number of acres has grown, and you look at the current landscape for wine, which is not positive. I mean, wine's down the last year 7, 8, 10%. Yeah, what is the industry as a whole going to do? And, you know, in Oregon, even today, still doesn't have that Saint Michel wine estates, which, interestingly now, is also struggling. You know, what are the points of difference? You know, a lot of it gets back to marketing. And why should someone pick up a bottle of wine these days when you've got all these other beverage alcohol choices, and you've got the sort of the neo-prohibitionists at work in a very strong way, all the way up to the Surgeon General. So these are challenging times for beverage alcohol in general. But the wine industry in particular, I think, has to find a way to make themselves even more relevant. And what do? Do you make it easier to understand? Do you make it more complex? What is it? I mean, you know, I've been away from it hands-on for 15 years. But I still, of course, watch what's going on because, you know, sake is somewhat parallel to that. So, yeah, I really don't know if I have anything to add as to what I would tell the industry to do, because there are growing pains, and as long as the pie grows, then everybody benefits. But the pie is not growing; it's shrinking. So, unfortunately, when that happens, it's all about maintaining market share. And obviously, you've got Oregon wineries of size now, A to Z. Acrobat, you know, some of these brands that, you know, several 100,000 cases. Yeah, those are, they are now, you now have sort of these more well-funded models out there. So if you're a small operation and maybe, you know, let's face it, the average Oregon winery still is what, under 5,000 cases. So their model has to be primarily direct to consumer. If tasting room counts are down, how do you get people to come to your tasting room? How do you get people to join your wine club? Again, it's back to points of difference. What makes you relevant? And 6 words I'll always remember that I've said over and over again in terms of marketing. It's very simple. It applies to anything. It's find a need and fill it. So you can't just make wine and put it out there and expect people to buy it, particularly at higher price points. And Oregon's got a great reputation. They need to uphold that reputation. That's my 2 cents worth.
You mentioned you're planning to retire soon. Congratulations in advance on that. Tell me about future plans for yourself, either personally or professionally. Anything you're excited about over the next few years?
Well, kind of coinciding with retirement is, well, when I remarried 22 years ago, I ended up with 2 additional children, so I have 4 kids now. I had twins when I was 45. They're now 20. They're both in university here in Oregon. So being empty nesters. But I think what's benefited me is that I worked with the ownership of SakéOne and said, I gave them, in 3 years, here's where I want to be, kind of heading towards the sunset. And so they allowed me to find my heir apparent, which I've done. And he's actually going to take over as president of SakéOne next week. Oh, wow. I'll retain my CEO title for a year. So I'll be available for him to pick my brain whenever he needs to. And then after a year, I'll officially be retired, but I'll continue on a consulting basis for the company for 2 to 3 years, continue as a board director. So I'm kind of this slow, I can't just stop and walk away. I want to continue to do what I can to assure the long-term success of the company and keep my mind busy. But no different than a lot of people when they get towards retirement. My wife and I have travel plans. I do play golf. I had a lot of fun playing golf with some Oregon wine folks. Bill Hatcher, Dick Erath. So yeah, my golf game could always use improvement. But and I just love being outdoors. Love being outdoors. And got 4 healthy kids that are great. So we'll see. We'll see what else. But yeah, certainly by virtue of staying on the board, I get to go to Japan every year. I had never been to Japan until I went to SakéOne. Obviously, I always went to the continent of Europe, where the wine regions were. So, but now I've been to Japan 24 times. So, and I love it. I would highly recommend if someone hasn't been to Japan, please go. You just won't. The people are so friendly. The food scene is great. It's not just sushi. The thing about the Japanese, particularly on the culinary side, if they want to do Italian food or pasta, try it. You would think you were in Italy. Same with French food. Whatever they do, they perfect it. So it's great. So continue to travel, and I will go back. I will go back to Europe. I will do that as well. But I've got my bucket list. Got my bucket list of travel places.
What's top of the bucket list?
New Zealand. Some places I've never been. Yeah.
All right, last question for you. Proudest accomplishment, greatest achievement. As you look back, what are you proudest of?
I would say the many faceted roles I've had to help the Oregon wine industry get where it is today. I'm that bridge generation between the pioneers and now third, and then so many of the folks in Oregon wine now obviously came later, came from other places or other regions. Of course, you've got this big influx of investment now in Oregon, whether it's from Italy or where have you, France, of course. But I'd say that's the biggest. Not to say I'm not proud of what I've done at SakéOne, because we are a force in the sake business in America now, and that will continue to be. But I go back to when I was 5 years old and watching those bubbles in that fermentation lock, and to see where the industry has come from those early days. And there's challenges today, as I just spoke of, in the industry, but nothing like what it was then. It is so hard to carve out a reputation as being some of the best in the world at a beverage that has so much legacy like wine. So here's to a lot more great Oregon wine.
Fantastic. Love it. All the questions I have for you. Anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to cover? Anything I didn't ask that I should have asked?
Oh, I'm sure we talked a lot. I talked a lot. No, I don't think so. I think I've pretty much touched on it all.
It's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Oh, you bet. Well, it's a little different because of the two facets, but
It's a very unique story, but it's really interesting. The depth in both is really fascinating.
Well, I'm glad because I know Linfield's interviewed my parents, my cousin Matt. To whatever extent I'm a inspiration to him. It's interesting because his dad, who's passed, he was my godfather. He was my dad's kid brother. So his dad, Rich, was born when my dad was 16. And when Rich turned 16, I was born. When I was 16, Matt was born. Rich's son, Matt, was born. When, let's see, when Matt turned 16, my son, Max, was born. Let's see, is it still? Yeah, so anyway, so it's been like 16-year period, this thing, and yet now I think, uh-oh, what's going to happen next? Who's going to happen? Well, my son Max, let's see, when he turned 16, Matt's son Carter was born. Yeah, there's a string of 16, which is just pretty crazy.
That's amazing.
Pretty crazy, yeah.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time.
You bet.
Sharing with us, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Okay, well, thanks for coming out.